November 1944. Warsaw is a graveyard. The city is not just damaged, it is a corpse of brick and ice, systematically destroyed and emptied of its entire population. German forces are preparing their retreat, leaving behind a silent, frozen expanse of rubble. But it is not entirely empty. Hiding in the ruins, one of perhaps 20 Jews left alive in the entire city, is Władysław Szpilman. He was once a celebrated pianist. Now he is a starving shadow, jaundiced and weak, hiding in the attic of an abandoned military building. Driven by starvation, he searches a derelict kitchen for a scrap of food. He hears a sound. A voice cuts through the silence. "What are you doing here?" Szpilman freezes. Standing in the doorway is a tall, immaculate German officer. For the pianist, this is the end. Arrest, interrogation, execution. But this moment doesn't end in execution. The officer, Captain Wilm Hosenfeld, will make a choice that saves Władysław Szpilman's life. This is the central, tragic paradox of the story. That single act of humanity would not be enough to save his own. The officer who saved a life in the ruins of Warsaw would himself die a brutal and anonymous death years later, captive in a Soviet prison. He would go to his grave never knowing that his act of mercy had been remembered, or that the man whose life he saved was desperately trying to find him. To understand the starving man in the attic, you must first understand the brilliant artist he was. Władysław Szpilman was not just any musician. He was one of Warsaw's brightest talents. Born in 1911, his life was defined by music. He mastered his craft first at the Chopin Academy of Music in Warsaw, then at the prestigious Academy of Arts in Berlin from 1931 to 1933. When the new German regime took power in 1933, Szpilman returned to Warsaw. By 1935, he was a celebrated pianist and composer. He became the house pianist for Polish radio, where his performances of classical and jazz pieces, especially his beloved Chopin, were broadcast to the entire nation. He was a man at the peak of his career, a symbol of Poland's vibrant cultural life. Then, on September 23, 1939, that life was severed. Szpilman was in the studio, performing live on Polish radio. He was playing Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, a piece full of melancholy and grace. As his hands moved over the keys, the sound of German bombs hitting Warsaw began to roar outside. The explosions grew closer until the broadcast was interrupted mid-performance. The signal went dead. That was the last live music heard on Polish radio. The music and the old Warsaw had been silenced. By November 1940, German authorities forced Warsaw's Jews into a sealed ghetto. For Szpilman, the world shrank from a vibrant nation to a few cramped, starving streets. He and his entire family, his parents, his brother, and his 2 sisters, were confined there. The celebrated concert pianist was now just another prisoner, desperate to survive. To support his family, he did the only thing he knew. He played the piano. He found work in the ghetto's cafes, his music becoming a grim parody of his former life. He played for audiences who were starving, dying in the streets, and haunted by the daily terror of deportation. It was a horrifying backdrop to the art he once performed in Europe's most celebrated halls. In 1942, the relative horror of the cafes gave way to an absolute systematic nightmare. German authorities began the mass deportations from the ghetto, shipping hundreds of thousands to the Treblinka extermination camp. Szpilman and his family were rounded up with thousands of others at the Umschlagplatz, the horrifying collection point for the death trains. In the chaos of this moment, standing in line with his parents, brother, and sisters, all of them knew this was the end. But in a random, brutal twist of fate, a Jewish policeman in the crowd recognized the famous pianist. As Szpilman was being pushed toward the train, the officer grabbed him, pulled him from the line, and screamed at him to run. He never saw his family again. He was saved by a flicker of recognition, while his entire family was murdered at Treblinka. He was left completely alone. After escaping the ghetto in February 1943, Szpilman's life became a series of hidden rooms and silent attics. He was sheltered by courageous Polish friends who risked not only their own lives, but those of their entire families, as helping Jews was punishable by collective death. For over a year he moved from shadow to shadow. Then, in August 1944, the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising. For 63 brutal days, the city became a battlefield. The Germans crushed it. But their revenge was not just victory, it was annihilation. After the uprising's defeat, they evacuated the entire remaining Polish population. Szpilman's protectors were forced to leave with everyone else. He was left behind. He was now completely, utterly alone, a ghost in a city being systematically erased, with no food, no water, and the freezing winter approaching. This was the desperate man found in the attic. But who was the officer in the immaculate uniform? This was Captain Wilm Hosenfeld. And to understand his choice, you must understand the man inside the uniform. He was not a hardened ideologue. He was born in 1895 into a devout Catholic family in central Germany. His entire family were school teachers. By trade, Hosenfeld was a teacher himself. He was a patriot, a veteran of World War I, who had been wounded and earned the Iron Cross. But his identity was shaped more by his deep religious faith and his role as a husband and a father to 5 children than by any political party. He was, in short, a man of profound moral and religious tradition, who was now serving a regime that stood against everything he was raised to believe. This was the man who found Szpilman in the ruins. Like many patriotic Germans, Hosenfeld joined the Nazi Party in 1935. He too was swept up in the promise of national restoration, hoping the movement would rebuild Germany's strength and prosperity after the humiliation of World War I. But the man who believed in this national renewal in theory would come to despise what it meant in practice. When he was drafted in 1939, he was 44 years old. Stationed in Poland, his official role was sports and culture officer for German soldiers. Not a frontline combat position, but this gave him a front-row seat to the occupation's unfiltered horror. He saw the creation of the Warsaw Ghetto. He witnessed over 400,000 Jews crammed into a tiny district, starving and dying in the streets. He saw the deportations. He saw the brutality. This reality began to eat away at his conscience, creating a profound internal conflict between his duty as a soldier and his conscience as a man. The disillusionment festering in Hosenfeld wasn't just a passing doubt, it was a crisis of the soul. He began to secretly document the atrocities he witnessed, filling private diaries with his horror and shame. These were not the writings of a loyal officer. They were the confession of a man witnessing hell. He wrote, "With the horrible mass murder of the Jews, we have lost this war." This wasn't a military calculation, but a moral one. His diary entries are incontrovertible proof of his mindset. He continued, "We have brought an indelible shame upon ourselves, a curse that cannot be lifted." While his uniform represented the regime, his private words condemned it. He was a man living a dangerous double life, one of outward duty and one of secret, profound dissent. Hosenfeld's diary was one part of his rebellion. His actions were the other. The act of mercy he would show Szpilman was not a random whim. It was the culmination of his established character. He had a history of these quiet choices. He actively employed a Jewish man named Leon Worm, who had miraculously escaped from a train bound for the Treblinka death camp. Hosenfeld provided him with false papers and a job at the German-run sports stadium, effectively hiding him in plain sight. This wasn't an isolated case. He used his position to intervene and free Polish prisoners from detention. Later, during the brutal Warsaw Uprising in 1944, he was assigned to interrogate captured resistance fighters. He directly defied orders to treat them as criminals, demanding they be treated humanely under the rules of the Geneva Convention. Wilm Hosenfeld's conscience was not just passive, it was dangerously active. And so we return to the abandoned building, armed with the full story of these two men. The emaciated pianist stands before the tall, imposing officer. The confrontation is set. Hosenfeld asks Szpilman what he is doing. Szpilman admits the truth. He is Jewish, and he is hiding. The officer asks his profession. Szpilman, looking at his own ruined state, replies that he was a pianist. Hosenfeld, the former teacher and culture officer, looks at the skeletal figure before him. Perhaps in skepticism, perhaps out of a genuine curiosity, he leads Szpilman downstairs to a room that holds a single, intact piano. He gestures to the instrument and gives a simple, quiet command. "Prove it." Szpilman sits at the bench. His hands are filthy, his fingers stiff and nearly useless from cold, malnutrition, and fear. He hesitates. Then he begins to play. It is Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. It is the exact same piece he was playing on Polish radio when the German bombs interrupted his broadcast and his world in 1939. The music, a defiant symbol of beauty and all that was lost, echoes through the freezing, demolished building, a ghost playing for a soldier of the very army that had created this hell. Hosenfeld listened in silence as the music finished, the notes hanging in the freezing air. In that moment, the confrontation between enemy and victim evaporated. The officer had made his decision. The tension of the hook, the fear of immediate execution, was finally broken. Hosenfeld didn't just let Szpilman go. He actively chose to save him. He showed Szpilman a secure hiding place in the building's attic. He returned later, bringing precious food, bread and jam, a feast for a man who had forgotten what it was to eat. Most significantly, as the winter cold intensified, Hosenfeld returned and gave Szpilman his own German military greatcoat, a thick, warm garment to protect him from the frost. It was an astonishing act of shared humanity. Before leaving, he offered one final assurance: the war would end soon. "Hold on," he said. "Just a little longer." In mid-December, Hosenfeld came for the last time. His unit was evacuating Warsaw. The Soviets were just days away. He brought Szpilman extra bread and a warm blanket for the journey ahead. As he prepared to leave, a final, crucial exchange took place. Perhaps embarrassed by his uniform or the regime he represented, Hosenfeld never offered his own name, but Szpilman insisted. He felt an overwhelming need to offer the only thing he had. "You haven't asked me," he said, but I want you to remember. Szpilman, Polish radio." It was a desperate pledge, loaded with a tragic irony that only the future would reveal. "If something happens to you and I can help, remember that name." Hosenfeld left. That promise, made by a ghost in the ruins, would become a defining, desperate quest for the rest of Szpilman's life. He just didn't know it yet. On January 17, 1945, the Soviet army entered Warsaw. The city was liberated. Władysław Szpilman, having survived the impossible, was finally free. But this story is defined by a profound and bitter irony. On the exact same day that Szpilman's life was being given back to him, Wilm Hosenfeld's was being taken away. On January 17th, during a skirmish just 30 kilometers from the city, Captain Hosenfeld was captured by those same Soviet forces as one Mann's ordeal ended. The others began. Szpilman soon returned to Polish radio, his life and the station slowly being rebuilt. For his very first broadcast after the war, there was only one choice. He sat at the piano and played Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, the same piece, the same man completing the performance that the bombs had cut short in 1939. The music had finally returned. For Wilm Hosenfeld, liberation was the beginning of his end. He was captured by the Soviets, imprisoned, and charged with war crimes. His crime, according to the Soviet tribunal, he had interrogated prisoners during the Warsaw uprising and was therefore deemed complicit in oppression. This charge was a twisted distortion of the truth. It ignored the fact that he had used that very position to defy orders, demanding those same prisoners be treated humanely under the Geneva Convention. The system he was in saw only his uniform, not his actions. From a prison camp in 1946, Hosenfeld wrote a desperate, heartbreaking letter to his wife. He listed the names of the Jews and Poles he had saved, including Leon Worm and Władysław Szpilman, begging her, "Find them. Ask them to testify on my behalf." But his plea was invisible to his captors. In 1950, a military tribunal in Minsk sentenced him to 25 years of hard labor. The Gulag was brutal. In 1947, Hosenfeld had already suffered a severe stroke that left his right side paralyzed. His health was failing, and the man who chose mercy in the ruins was now a dying prisoner, lost to the world. Meanwhile, in a free Warsaw, Szpilman was a man haunted by a debt he couldn't repay. He didn't even know the name of the officer who had saved him. For 5 years he searched. The breakthrough finally came in 1950. Leon Worm, the other man Hosenfeld had rescued from the brink of death, managed to make contact with Hosenfeld's wife and then found Szpilman. He finally had a name, Wilm Hosenfeld. The race against time began. Szpilman and others immediately, desperately, petitioned the Soviet authorities for Hosenfeld's release. They provided sworn testimony about his humanitarian actions, about the lives he had risked his own neck to save. It was all for nothing. The Soviets, in their rigid, paranoid state, refused to consider it. A German officer was a war criminal, full stop. The testimony of his good deeds was ignored, dismissed as irrelevant. The system that had captured him was incapable of seeing the man. While Szpilman was fighting for his freedom, Hosenfeld was dying. On August 13, 1952, Wilm Hosenfeld died of an aortic rupture in a Soviet prison hospital. He died alone, never knowing the man he saved was fighting for him until the very end. After Hosenfeld's death, the tragedy was compounded by silence. Szpilman had tried to honor his savior immediately. He published a memoir in 1946 titled The Death of a City, which detailed the officer's merciful act. But the story was quickly buried. Soviet authorities now, in control of Poland, censored the book. In their official propaganda, a humanitarian German officer could not exist. They even changed his nationality from German to Austrian to fit their narrative. Hosenfeld's story, like his body, was lost. For decades, the story remained a secret. Then, in 1998, the delayed resolution finally arrived. Szpilman's son André published a new, uncensored edition of the memoir. This time it was titled The Pianist. Crucially, this new edition included excerpts from Wilm Hosenfeld's own diaries. The book became an international bestseller, and in 2002, Roman Polanski's film adaptation won 3 Academy Awards. The world finally knew his name. Władysław Szpilman died on July 6, 2000, at the age of 88. He never stopped trying to honor the man who saved him. His efforts, amplified by the publication of The Pianist and the crucial newly public evidence from Hosenfeld's own diaries, finally broke through the wall of history. In 2009, after reviewing the new evidence of his consistent efforts to help victims, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial, posthumously recognized Captain Wilm Hosenfeld as Righteous Among the Nations, a title for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews. On December 4, 2011, a commemorative plaque was unveiled at the building where the two men met. In a moment of powerful closure, the children of Władysław Szpilman and the children of Wilm Hosenfeld stood together at the ceremony. The story isn't about grand rebellion. It's about quiet, individual choices in a world gone mad. It's about one act of mercy in the ruins, an act that was finally and fully remembered by the world.